14:15 in the afternoon. The Gulf of Oman. The P-8 Poseidon was exactly 90 miles south of Bandar Abbas. When the first warning tone chirped in the cockpit, the aircraft maintained a steady heading of 180 degrees, its sensors sweeping the dark water for submarine signatures. Below the aircraft, the sea was a sheet of hammered silver, reflecting a sun that burned white and hot in a cloudless sky. Inside the pressurized cabin, the air felt thin and smelled of copper and ozone. The flight was supposed to be a standard intelligence patrol, one of dozens conducted every month in these contested waters. A sensor operator at Station 3 leaned forward, his eyes fixed on a green strobe on his primary display. His hands hovered over the keyboard. Something was coming from the north at 900 kilometers per hour. An Iranian F-4 Phantom had just launched from a coastal airbase, climbing fast and aggressive. It was cutting through the heavy salt air like a blade. The American pilot, Lieutenant Commander Mark Sullivan, felt the heavy vibration of his own engines through the soles of his boots. He adjusted his headset, the plastic cold against his skin. Sullivan looked out the left side cockpit window, squinting against the glare. A speck of gray appeared against the yellow haze of the Iranian coastline. The speck grew larger with terrifying speed. The Iranian jet was an old platform, a relic of a different era, but its twin engines left a thick trail of black soot that marked its path across the sky like a charcoal smudge. It did not follow the standard international intercept protocol. It did not pull up alongside the Poseidon to signal its presence or establish radio contact. The Phantom dived from the sun, screaming across the American nose cone. Then came the sound. It was a staccato rhythm of mechanical hammers striking steel. The Iranian pilot had squeezed the trigger of his 20mm cannon. Bright orange tracers zipped past the cockpit glass, so close that Sullivan could see the individual spheres of chemical fire. The smell of burnt powder and cordite seemed to seep through the very skin of the aircraft. The Poseidon shuddered violently as the wake of the passing fighter slammed into its wings. The American crew gripped their armrests, their knuckles turning white against the dark plastic. Sullivan pushed the nose down, trying to create distance and gain airspeed, but the Poseidon was a converted airliner, slow and heavy. The Phantom was far more agile. The Iranian jet pulled a high-gravity turn, its wings slicing through the air with a visible shimmer of heat. It rolled onto its back, inverted, and then dropped into a dominant position directly behind the Poseidon's tail. In the American cockpit, the atmosphere changed instantly. The steady, comforting hum of the avionics was drowned out by a continuous, piercing electronic scream. The threat warning receiver on the main dash turned from a cautious amber to a solid, pulsating red. This was not a search radar. It was a fire control lock. The Iranian pilot had transitioned from a warning to a lethal intent. He had his finger on the missile release button, and the computer was telling him exactly where to fire to bring the American plane down. The P-8 was defenseless against a direct missile hit. It carried no air-to-air weapons. Its only hope was the electronic warfare suite and the skill of the crew. Sullivan felt a drop of sweat run down his neck, disappearing into his flight suit. The cockpit was suddenly too small, the air too thick. Every man and woman on the aircraft knew the sound of that lock. It was the sound of a countdown. The Iranian jet held the lock, refusing to break away. It shadowed every move Sullivan made, staying firmly in the 6 o'clock position. The red light continued to pulse, casting a rhythmic, bloody glow over the flight instruments. The Iranian pilot was not just watching them. He was aiming at their engines. He was waiting for a reason, or perhaps just a momentary lapse in judgment, to finish what he had started. With the cannon burst, the Gulf remained silent below them. But in the air, the tension was a physical weight that threatened to crush the breath out of the crew. 14:16 in the afternoon. Inside the vibrating hull of the P-8 Poseidon, the lethal lock tone changed, from a chirp to a continuous, soul-crushing scream. It was a digital siren that filled every corner of the cockpit. On the center console, the threat display showed a solid red box. This was the point of no return. The Iranian F-4 Phantom was no longer just shadowing them. It was hunting them. The American crew knew that the Iranian pilot had his finger on a two-stage trigger. One more millimeter of pressure would release a missile that would bridge the gap between the two aircraft in less than 4 seconds. The air in the cabin was thick, with the smell of recycled oxygen and the sharp, metallic scent of ozone from the overworked computers. Every sensor on the aircraft was pushed to its thermal limit. Lieutenant Commander Mark Sullivan felt the vibration of the control yoke in his palms. It was a heavy, sluggish weight. He was flying a modified airliner against a supersonic fighter jet. It was a knife fight, where he was holding a suitcase. He glanced at his co-pilot, Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins. Her face was a mask of professional focus, but her chest was heaving with the effort of breathing. "Lock is steady. 6 o'clock low," Jenkins reported. "He is not blinking, Commander. He is painting us with everything he has got." Sullivan did not look back. He could not afford to. Begin emergency defensive maneuvers. Manual override on the countermeasure system. Give me everything we have. Behind them, in the darkened sensor gallery, the crew worked with frantic precision. They were strapped into their high-backed seats, their faces illuminated by the eerie blue light of their workstations. The sensor operator at Station 4, Petty Officer Second Class Miller, hit the arming switches for the flare and chaff dispensers. He watched the digital readouts on his screen. The P-8 carried hundreds of small blocks of magnesium and aluminum. Their job was to create a cloud of fire and metal to confuse the Iranian seeker. Chaff and flares are hot. Standing by for manual release, Miller shouted over the intercom. Outside the aircraft, the environment was a contrast of terrifying beauty. The sun sat high and indifferent, casting long, sharp shadows over the Gulf. The water below was a deep, bruised purple, showing white caps where the wind whipped the surface. The Iranian F-4 Phantom hung in the air like a predatory insect. It was so close that Sullivan could see the heat distortion shimmering off its twin engines. The black soot from the Iranian exhaust began to coat the white stabilizers of the American plane. It was a physical mark of the aggression. The Iranian pilot, Major Zandi, sat in his own cockpit, surrounded by the smell of old leather and jet fuel. His eyes were fixed on the green crosshairs of his heads-up display. The American plane filled his entire field of vision. To him, the P-8 was not an aircraft. It was a target. It was a massive, slow-moving intruder in his backyard. His thumb hovered over the red weapon release button on top of the stick. The safety cover was already flipped up, revealing the small, lethal switch. He felt the heavy throb of his engines, a primal power that the American aircraft could not match. "They are turning," Zandi whispered to himself. He saw the Poseidon's wings tilt to the left. Sullivan was pushing the aircraft into a maximum rate descending turn. He was trying to use the denser air at lower altitudes to sluggish the Iranians' pursuit. The airframes groaned under the stress. Inside the cabin, a loose flight manual slid off a console and slammed into the floorboards. The sound was like a gunshot. The crew flinched. The P-8 was screaming. As it dove toward the water, the airspeed indicator climbing into the red. "He is staying with us," Jenkins cried out. "The lock is still solid. He is ignoring the movement." The red box on the display stayed fixed. It was a digital death sentence that refused to go away. Sullivan could feel the sweat stinging his eyes. He did not wipe it away. His world was reduced to the instruments and the sound of that screaming tone. The Iranian pilot was showing a level of discipline and aggression that they had not seen in years. This was not a routine encounter. This was a deliberate attempt to force a confrontation. The Poseidon leveled out at only 500 meters above the waves. The sea was a blur of blue and white beneath them. The salt spray from the ocean began to coat the lower sensors of the aircraft. Still, the Iranian Phantom followed. It was a shadow that could not be shaken. The electronic warfare suite was throwing out every trick in the book, jamming the Iranian frequencies, but the pilot behind them was manual tracking now. He did not need the radar anymore. He had them in his sights. "Prepare for impact," Sullivan said, his voice dropping to a low, steady growl. "If he fires, we have 3 seconds, not a moment more." The silence that followed in the cabin was absolute, broken only by the mechanical scream of the threat receiver. They were waiting for the flash. They were waiting for the end. 14:17 in the afternoon. The communications suite of the P-8 Alpha Poseidon. The air inside the cabin was rapidly heating up. The massive computer racks, working at full capacity to process the electronic warfare data, poured heat into the narrow aisles. It smelled like hot dust and scorched plastic. Petty Officer Rodriguez, the lead communications operator, felt her headset pressing against her ears, the plastic damp with sweat. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She wasn't just sending a report. She was screaming for help into the digital void. Flash. 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 Rodriguez said into her microphone. Her voice was steady, a product of 1,000 hours of drill. But her eyes were wide. This is Trident 7-4. We are under active weapons lock by one Iranian F-4 Phantom. Coordinates 24 degrees 40 minutes north, 58 degrees 20 minutes east. We are engaging defensive measures. Request immediate assistance. The message traveled at the speed of light. It bounced off a satellite hovering high above the Earth and slammed into the antennas of the 7th Fleet Command Center. Thousands of miles away and hundreds of miles away on a carrier deck, the words appeared in red on every screen. The United States Navy was now fully aware that a crisis had begun. Back in the Poseidon, the situation was deteriorating. The screaming tone of the Iranian radar lock had become a physical presence, a vibration that seemed to rattle the very bones of the crew. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan pulled the aircraft into a hard bank to the right, the wings groaning under the weight of the maneuver. The ocean below was a blur of dark turquoise and white foam. Electronic countermeasures, go, Sullivan barked. At his station, Petty Officer Miller smashed his palm against the activation switch for the jamming suite. Deep inside the belly of the plane, powerful transmitters came to life. They didn't fire bullets, they fired invisible storms of radio energy. The air between the American plane and the Iranian fighter was suddenly flooded with electronic white noise. On the Iranian pilot's radar screen, the clear target of the Poseidon began to flicker. It stretched, doubled, and then dissolved into a chaotic mess of false returns. Inside the Iranian F-4 Phantom, Major Zondi growled in frustration. His cockpit was a cramped, vibrating metal box that smelled of old hydraulic fluid and the sharp tang of his own adrenaline. The green radar screen in front of him was suddenly washed out by a blizzard of electronic interference. The lock-on tone in his own headset began to stutter and break. He squinted through his visor, his eyes searching the horizon. He could still see the massive white and gray shape of the American plane through his canopy, but his missiles were losing their digital grip. "You think you can hide?" Zandy muttered. He kicked his rudder, banking the heavy fighter to stay on the tail of the Poseidon. He didn't need the radar to tell him where they were. He could see the sunlight glinting off their windows. The Poseidon was low now, less than 300 meters above the surface of the Gulf. The turbulence from the warm air rising off the water slammed into the plane like a series of hammer blows. Sullivan fought the controls, his muscles straining against the hydraulic resistance. Every time he turned, the Iranian jet turned with him, a persistent, black-suited shadow that refused to let go. "The jamming is holding, but he's not breaking off," Miller shouted from the back. "He's flying visually. He's trying to get back into gun range." The tension in the cabin was a physical weight. The crew could feel the vibration of the Iranians' engines through the air, a low-frequency thrum that made the floorboards dance. They were alone in a vast, empty stretch of the ocean, a billion-dollar laboratory being chased by a Cold War relic, with a pilot who seemed to have nothing to lose. Rodriguez waited for a reply on the radio. The silence was agonizing. She could hear the static of the atmosphere, a dry, empty hiss that offered no comfort. Then, through the noise, a new voice broke through. It was crisp, professional, and carried the weight of the entire Pacific Command. "Trident 7-4. This is Eagle Strike. We have your flash. 2 FA-18 Super Hornets are off the deck and heading your way. ETA is 7 minutes. Hold on, Trident. Help is coming." Sullivan heard the message and felt a momentary surge of hope, but his eyes went back to the threat display. 7 minutes was an eternity, when a missile could bridge the gap in 4 seconds. The Iranian pilot was closing the distance again, the nose of his fighter dipping. As he prepared for another run, the air outside was thick with the scent of sea salt and the invisible energy of a war being fought in the electromagnetic spectrum. 7 minutes, Sullivan whispered to himself. He gripped the yoke tighter. We don't have 7 minutes. Behind them, the Iranian Phantom leveled its wings. The pilot's thumb returned to the red button. He was done with the games. He didn't need a perfect lock. He just needed to get close enough that the P-8 couldn't run. The chase continued, 2 streaks of metal, and fire racing across the lonely silver mirror of the sea surface at high speed. Distance between aircraft closing. 14:18 in the afternoon. The flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln in the North Arabian Sea. The heat on the deck was a physical wall, thick with the smell of vaporized jet fuel and the metallic tang of non-skid coating. 2 F-18 Super Hornets sat on catapults 1 and 2, their engines screaming at a pitch that vibrated through the steel of the ship and into the soles of the deck crew's boots. The jet blast deflectors were up, glowing from the sheer intensity of the exhaust. The shooters, dressed in their bright yellow jerseys, moved with a practiced, lethal grace. With a sharp, sudden motion of a hand, the catapults fired. Accelerating from 0 to 250 kilometers per hour in under 2 seconds, the pilots were crushed back into their seats, the breath forced out of their lungs as the world became a blur of blue water and gray steel. As soon as the wheels left the deck, the landing gear retracted with a heavy mechanical thud. The lead pilot, Lieutenant Commander Viper Vance, snapped his visor down. The sky ahead was a hazy yellow, but his destination was a single point of crisis, 90 miles to the north. Viper 1-1 is airborne, Vance said into his mask. His voice was distorted by the heavy breathing of the oxygen system, punching through the sound barrier. We are 6 minutes out. He slammed the throttles forward into full afterburner. 2 massive plumes of blue and orange fire erupted from the back of his jet, pushing the aircraft through the invisible wall of the sound barrier with a thunderous crack that echoed across the empty ocean. Behind him, his wingman did the same. They were no longer flying. They were falling forward at 1,800 kilometers per hour. The air outside their cockpit screamed as it was torn apart by the sharp edges of their wings. 90 miles away, the situation for the P-8 Alpha Poseidon had reached a breaking point. The aircraft was low, so low that the white salt spray from the wave tops was being sucked into the intake of the left engine. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan was fighting the yoke with both hands, his arm muscles burning with fatigue. The plane was bucking and heaving in the turbulent air. Every few seconds, the belly of the plane would skip over a swell, the proximity alarm wailing in his ears. 5 minutes, Sullivan groaned. He's closing. I can see his nose gun. Behind them, Major Zandi in the Iranian Phantom had seen the American plane drop to the deck. He followed, descending into the salt-heavy air. He was focused on the massive tail of the Poseidon. He could see the individual rivets on the American skin. He could see the sensor pods. He could see the fear in the way the plane was twitching. Zandi reached out and flipped the master arm switch to the on position. A small green light illuminated on his panel. He was no longer playing a game of chicken. He was preparing to kill. He aligned his gun sight with the center of the Poseidon's fuselage. He wanted a clean break. He wanted the American plane to vanish in a single, spectacular fireball that would be seen for 50 miles. He's in the slot, Sarah Jenkins screamed from the co-pilot's seat. He's got a gun solution. Brake left. Brake left. Sullivan kicked the rudder pedal and shoved the yoke hard to the left. The P-8 groaned, a sound of metal being pushed to its absolute structural limit. The massive wings tilted, and the plane slid sideways through the air. A second later, a stream of 20mm shells ripped through the space where they had been a heartbeat before. The shells hit the water, kicking up white geysers of foam that looked like miniature explosions. The sound of the Iranian cannon was a terrifying, guttural roar that traveled through the air and shook the Poseidon's windows. The crew in the back were thrown against their harnesses. Petty Officer Miller saw the tracers flash past his window, a blur of white-hot light that left a temporary scar on his vision. The smell of the sea was replaced by the acrid, chemical stink of burning powder that seemed to linger in the very air they breathed. He missed. Sullivan panted, his chest heaving. But he's coming back around. He's not going to miss twice. The Iranian Phantom pulled a high G climb, trading its speed for altitude, preparing for a diving attack. Trading its speed for altitude, preparing for a diving attack. Zandy looked down at his prey. The American plane looked like a wounded whale, struggling to stay above the water. He felt a surge of professional pride. He was the master of this sky. He rolled his jet onto its back, ready to dive for the final blow. Ready to dive for the final blow. But then, his radar warning receiver began to chirp. It wasn't the steady, slow pulse of a searching pate. It was a high-frequency, aggressive sweep coming from the south. It was the sound of something much faster, much deadlier, and much more hungry. 14:19 in the afternoon. The contested airspace over the Gulf of Oman. The Iranian F-4 Phantom dived through the haze, its twin engines screaming. Major Zandy could see the heat haze shimmering off the Pate's engines. He knew the American fighters were closing the distance at twice his speed. He had only seconds to act before his tactical advantage vanished forever. The green circle of his weapon sight centered on the right side engine of the American plane. He didn't want a warning anymore. He wanted a kill. Inside the P-8 Alpha Poseidon, the cabin was a symphony of alarms. The heat from the electronic racks was becoming unbearable, the air smelling of sweat and scorched wiring. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan looked out his window and saw the Iranian jet roll into its final attack run. "Brace for impact," Sullivan shouted. "Flares! Flares! Flares!" Major Zandy squeezed the trigger. The short-range missile shrieked off the underwing rail, a brilliant white column of fire punching backward through the soot-stained air. The heat of the launch washed over the Phantom's fuselage as the weapon accelerated to twice the speed of sound in a single heartbeat. The chemical smell of the rocket propellant lingered in the Iranian cockpit for a split second as the missile streaked toward its target. The warhead punched into the outer casing of the Poseidon's No. 2 engine, detonating instantly. The blast shredded the titanium fan blades, sending jagged shards of hot metal screaming through the wing structure and the side of the cabin. A massive fireball erupted, fueled by high-pressure jet fuel, turning the silver engine housing into a mangled wreck of black soot and twisted orange flame. The pressure of the explosion blew out 3 of the small cabin windows, sending a spray of glass into the interior. Inside the Poseidon, the floorboards bucked upward as the shockwave compressed the air in the compartment. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan fought the controls with every ounce of his strength as the aircraft yawed violently to the right, the nose swinging toward the water. The flight deck was suddenly filled with the roar of rushing wind and the thick, acrid stink of burning oil and hydraulic fluid. In the back, Petty Officer Miller was thrown against his harness, the wind from the broken windows tearing at his flight suit. Black smoke trailed for a mile behind the crippled aircraft as it plummeted toward the waves. The radio went silent for 2 long seconds, replaced only by the sound of the wind tearing at the ruptured fuselage. Then, the cockpit was filled with the frantic calls of the crew, their voices high and tight with the realization that they were falling. "Engine number 2 is gone! Fire in the wing!" Sarah Jenkins screamed. She was already flipping the emergency fire suppression switches. "We're losing hydraulics! The yoke is frozen! I have it!" Sullivan groaned. His boots braced against the floor as he fought the heavy rudder. "Give me more power on 1. Level us out!" The P-8 was trailing a massive plume of oily smoke, its right wing charring, under the intense heat of the remaining fire. The ocean was less than 200 meters below, the waves looking like jagged teeth ready to tear the plane apart. The crew could feel the vibration of the damaged airframe, a sickening, low-frequency shudder that told them the plane was dying. Major Zandy pulled his Phantom up, banking to look back at the carnage he had created. He saw the black smoke and the fire. He saw the American plane struggling to stay in the air. He prepared to turn back for a second pass to finish the job. His cannon, armed and ready. Viper 1-1 is on station. A new voice boomed over the emergency frequency. It was cold, hard, and terrifyingly close. Suddenly, the sky above the Iranian pilot seemed to split open. Two F-18 Super Hornets dropped through the sun haze like falling bricks. They were no longer in afterburner, but their speed was still incredible. They didn't pass the Iranian jet, they surrounded it. One fighter took a position 1,000 meters above, while the other slid into a perfect firing position directly behind Zandy's tail. Iranian Phantom. This is the United States Navy, Lieutenant Commander Vance said. His voice was a monotone of lethal professional intent. You have just committed an act of war against a reconnaissance aircraft in international airspace. Break your turn and head north immediately, or you will be destroyed. Zandy looked up. He could see the gray bellies of the American fighters. He could see the AIM-120 missiles hanging from their rails. He could see the pilots looking down at him. The power dynamic had shifted in a heartbeat. The hunter was now the prey. Below them, the P-8 was still fighting for its life, the smoke from its burning engine marking a path toward the horizon. The ocean was cold and indifferent, waiting for the debris to fall. 14:20 in the afternoon. The turbulent airspace above the burning wake of the Poseidon. Major Zandy did not break north. He kicked his rudder and slammed the stick to the left with a violent, desperate motion. The old F-4 Phantom groaned under the sudden stress. It pulled 6 times the force of gravity, the metal skin of the wings rippling. Black smoke poured from its twin exhausts. Quote, as the pilot tried to loop back toward the crippled P-8, he wanted one more shot. He wanted to see the American plane disappear into the waves. Lieutenant Commander Vance saw the nose of the Iranian jet swing back toward the P-8. His eyes narrowed behind his visor. Eagle strike. The bandit is staying aggressive. Vance barked into his mask. Viper 1-1 is engaging. He pulled the stick back into his stomach. His G-suit inflated instantly with a sharp hiss. It squeezed his legs and torso to keep the blood in his brain. The F-18 Super Hornet pitched up like a striking cobra. The sky outside the canopy turned from a yellow haze to a deep, dark blue as the nose rose. The air inside the cockpit was thick with the scent of recycled oxygen and the salt from the sea below. Zandy looked up through his canopy and saw the American fighter crossing his flight path. He pulled harder on his own stick. His vision began to narrow into a dark tunnel from the intense G-load. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. They were 2 streaks of metal and fire dancing over the water. The sound of their engines was a continuous, earth-shaking thunder that drowned out everything else. Below them, the P-8 struggled to maintain its altitude. The smoke from the dead engine was a thick, black rope tied to the tail of the plane. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan looked back through the soot-stained glass. He saw the 2 fighters twisting in the sky. "He is staying with us, Viper," Sullivan called out. His voice was shaky from the adrenaline. "He is coming back for the kill. Stay on course, Trident," Vance replied. His voice was strained by the pressure of the turn. "We have him. Just keep that plane in the air." Vance switched his weapon system to the 20mm gun. He did not want to fire a missile. A heat-seeking missile might track the burning engine of the P-8 by mistake. He tracked the Iranian jet through his head-mounted display. Small green symbols danced across his visor. The F-18 shifted its weight with fluid grace. Its flight computers adjusted the flaps 100 times every second. It was a modern predator hunting a mechanical relic. Zandy realized he was losing the turn. The American jet was moving, with a speed he could not match. He saw the green tracers of the American gun sight on his own canopy. He dived toward the ocean. He hoped the thicker air near the waves would save him. The ocean rushed up to meet them. It was a blur of white foam and cold, dark water. The 2 planes screamed across the surface. They were less than 50 meters above the spray. The airframe of the F-4 began to shudder. It was at the edge of its structural limit. The Iranian pilot could feel the vibration through his teeth. Vance stayed on his tail like a perfect, lethal shadow. The salt spray from the ocean hit the American canopy. It left white streaks that vanished in the wind. "Last warning. Bandit," Vance said. "Break away now, or I will fire." Zandy's response was a sudden, violent roll to the right. He was trying to force the American to overshoot his position. It was a desperate move. Vance anticipated the maneuver. He pulled the throttles to idle and deployed the speed brakes. The Super Hornet shuddered as it hit an invisible wall of air resistance. The four shot forward, losing its advantage. In an instant, Vance was back on the power. His afterburners kicked in with a roar. He was now directly behind the Iranian jet. He had a perfect solution. The sky was silent for a heartbeat. The only sound was the wind rushing past the cockpits. Then, the sound of the 20mm cannon erupted. It was a guttural, mechanical growl. This time, it was not a warning burst across the bow. 14:21 in the afternoon, 50 meters above the churned white foam of the Gulf, the 20mm shells left the FA-18's gun at a rate of 100 rounds per second. It was a solid stream of high-explosive incendiary fire that bridged the gap between the two jets in less than half a breath. The rounds punched straight through the four Phantom's left engine intake and shredded the wing root. A shower of magnesium-white sparks and jagged aluminum fragments erupted from the Iranian jet, instantly blotted out by a thick, oily burst of orange flame. Inside the Iranian cockpit, the world became a nightmare of vibrating metal and screaming alarms. Major Zandy was slammed against the side of his canopy as the left engine exploded, the force of the detonation tearing the turbine blades apart. The fragments acted like 1,000 knives, severing hydraulic lines and fuel pipes. The smell of aerosolized jet fuel and burning electrical insulation filled his mask, choking him. The flight controls went limp in his hands. The aircraft began a violent, sickening roll to the left, the wing dipping toward the hungry waves. "I'm hit! I'm hit!" Zandy screamed into his radio, but the electronics were already dead. The Phantom was no longer a fighter jet. It was a 20-ton brick of burning steel. It entered a flat, lazy spiral, trailing a massive plume of black smoke that looked like a scar across the bright afternoon sky. Every time the aircraft rotated, Zandy saw a flash of the silver water and then a flash of the yellow sun. The heat from the burning wing was so intense that the plexiglass of his canopy began to bubble and cloud. He reached for the yellow and black striped ejection handles between his knees, his fingers fumbling against the high gravity of the spin. Vance pulled the Super Hornet into a sharp climb, banking his jet, to watch the wreckage fall. He could see the Iranian pilot struggling inside the glass bubble. The American pilot's heart was hammering against his ribs, the adrenaline making his vision sharp and crystalline. The air outside his canopy was silent now. The only sound, the steady, mechanical hiss of his own oxygen system. Trident. "The threat is neutralized," Vance reported. His voice was thick with the physical strain of the dogfight. "He is going down." "Repeat. The Bandit is going into the water." In the distance, the P-8 Alpha Poseidon was a small, dark shape against the horizon, still trailing its own rope of black smoke. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan heard the call and felt a wave of cold relief wash over him. His hands were still shaking on the yoke, his flight suit soaked through with sweat. The cockpit of the Poseidon was a wreck of broken glass and dangling wires. The wind was still howling through the open windows, a constant, mournful scream that made communication nearly impossible. "Copy, Viper," Sullivan replied. He looked at his fuel gauges. The right wing was still venting a fine mist of fuel, and the fire warning light for engine number 2 was still a steady, angry red. "We are losing pressure. In the main manifold, we have 5 minutes of flight time left, maybe less. We need a place to put this bird down." The ocean below was turning a darker shade of blue as the sun began its slow descent. The Iranian Phantom hit the water, 3 miles behind them. There was no spectacular explosion, just a massive white geyser of spray and a sudden, dead silence. The heavy engines dragged the airframe down instantly, leaving only a shimmering patch of rainbow-colored oil and a few floating pieces of honeycomb. Composite on the surface, there was no sign of a parachute. Vance circled the crash site once, his sensors scanning for any sign of life. There was nothing. The Gulf was a vast, empty mirror that had swallowed the aggressor whole. He turned his nose toward the P-8, his wingman sliding back into formation. They were two gray sharks guarding a wounded whale. "Trident, we are sticking with you," Vance said. "We have a visual on a small island 10 miles to the west. There is an old strip there. It's short, and it's rough, but it's the only solid ground within reach. Turn to heading 270. Sullivan looked at Sarah Jenkins. She nodded, her face streaked with soot and grease. He kicked the left rudder, the P-8 groaning in protest as it banked away. From the open sea, the aircraft was vibrating so hard now that the instruments were becoming a blur. The smell of the salt spray was thick in the cabin, mixing with the acrid stink of the dying engines. They were low, slow, and running out of time. The spiral was over, but the descent had just begun. 14:25 in the afternoon, the P-8 Alpha Poseidon hung in the air like a wounded bird. Its right wing was a blackened ruin. It vented a thin, white mist of hydraulic fluid into the slipstream. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan felt every shudder of the airframe through the control yoke. The yoke was heavy and sluggish. It resisted his every move. Below them, the island appeared. It was a narrow spine of yellow sand and jagged gray rock. A ring of white surf surrounded the shore. The landing strip was a cracked ribbon of asphalt. It was barely long enough for a small propeller plane. The air was hot and thick. It smelled of salt and the iron scent of the nearby sea. "Gear down," Sullivan commanded. His voice was raw. Sarah Jenkins pulled the lever. Two heavy mechanical thuds echoed through the floorboards. "Nose gear is down and locked," Jenkins reported. Her eyes were fixed on the panel. "Left main is down. Right main is nothing. We have a gear malfunction." The indicator light for the right landing gear remained a dark, hollow gray. The missile explosion had fused the gear doors shut. Sullivan looked at the altimeter. They were at 300 meters. The ground was rushing up to meet them. "We are landing on two wheels," Sullivan said. He gripped the yoke tighter. "Everyone, brace for a hard impact. This is going to be violent." In the back of the plane, the crew checked their harnesses one last time. Petty Officer Miller gripped the sides of his metal seat. His knuckles were white. The wind from the shattered windows was a cold, high-pitched scream. It filled the cabin and drowned out the sound of the internal comms. He could see the water getting closer through the jagged holes in the fuselage. The sea was a blur of dark blue and white. "Trident, you are looking good," Vance called from the FA-18 Super Hornet circling above. "Keep your nose up. Watch the crosswind. It is coming from the south at 20 knots. Vance watched the crippled plane from his cockpit. He saw the black smoke still pouring from the engine. He saw the lopsided landing gear. He knew the margin for error was zero. The P-8 was coming in too fast. It was too heavy for the short runway. The aircraft crossed the shoreline. The shadow of the plane raced across the sand. Sullivan pulled the nose up to bleed off airspeed. The stall warning began to chirp. It was a rhythmic, nagging sound. The remaining engine roared as Sullivan tried to balance the thrust. 50 meters, Jenkins called out. 40, 30. Level your wings. The left main tire touched the asphalt first. The sound was a deafening screech of rubber on stone. The plane tilted violently to the right as the weight shifted to the side with no gear. The tip of the right wing slammed into the ground. A shower of sparks and metal fragments flew into the air. The sound of metal grinding against asphalt was like 1,000 saws screaming at once. The P-8 veered toward the edge of the strip. The nose wheel slammed down and blew out instantly. The aircraft was a chaos of noise and vibration. Inside, the crew was slammed back and forth in their seats. The cabin filled with the smell of burning rubber and hot asphalt. Sullivan stood on the left brake. He fought to keep the plane from spinning into the rocks. The P-8 skidded down the runway. It shed pieces of its wing and belly along the path. Dust and sand swirled around the cockpit glass. It blotted out the world. The aircraft gave one final, bone-jarring lurch. Then, the motion stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The only sound was the clicking of cooling metal and the distant roar of the surf. The P-8 sat crooked on the runway. Its right wing rested on the ground like a broken limb. Smoke rose lazily from the wreckage into the hot, still air. 1500 hours. 3 in the afternoon. The remote island of Jazireh-Yashur. The P-8 Alpha Poseidon sat motionless on the cracked asphalt, a broken giant of steel and composite. The right wing was twisted upward, its tip buried in the sand and scorched black from the fire. Wisps of gray smoke drifted from the engine housing, curling slowly into the hot, stagnant air. The silence on the island was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of cooling metal and the distant, muffled roar of the waves hitting the rocks. The smell of burnt rubber, hydraulic fluid, and salt spray hung over the crash site like a physical weight. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Commander Mark Sullivan let out a long, shuddering breath. His hands, still gripped tightly around the yoke, were slick with sweat and shaking. He slowly released his hold, the plastic of the controls feeling cold and alien now that the vibration had stopped. He turned his head to look at Sarah Jenkins. Her face was pale beneath the streaks of soot, but her eyes were clear. "Everyone out," Sullivan said. His voice was a raspy whisper. "Get the crew to the beach. Move." They moved with the mechanical efficiency of people who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in flight simulators. They didn't run. They moved with a frantic, controlled urgency. One by one, the crew dropped from the main cabin door, their boots hitting the sand with heavy thuds. They carried only their survival vests and a single emergency radio. They didn't look back at the aircraft. They knew the danger of a secondary explosion was still real. They gathered 100 meters away, crouched behind a low ridge of volcanic rock. Petty Officer Miller looked back at the plane. From this distance, the P-8 looked small and vulnerable against the vast, empty horizon. The black smoke was thinning now, but the damage was undeniable. This was a billion-dollar intelligence platform, reduced to a pile of scrap on a forgotten strip of land. High above, the sound of jet engines returned. The 2 F-18 Super Hornets were still there, circling in a wide, protective orbit. They were the only things moving in the sky. Lieutenant Commander Vance looked down at the island, his eyes scanning the beach for his colleagues. He saw the small group of figures huddled near the rocks and felt a surge of professional relief. "Trident, we see you on the deck," Vance said. His voice was calm now, the lethal edge of the dogfight replaced by the steady tone of a mission near its end. "Rescue is inbound. They are 4 minutes out. Stay low and stay together." The sound of the jets was joined by a new, lower-frequency thrum. From the south, 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters appeared, flying low over the water to avoid radar detection. They kicked up massive clouds of white spray as they transitioned from the sea to the island. The downdraft from their rotors flattened the sparse grass and sent sand swirling into the air. The smell of the ocean was suddenly everywhere, a clean, sharp scent that signaled the end of the nightmare. The helicopters touched down 20 meters from the crew. The doors slid open, and Navy search and rescue. Swimmers jumped into the sand, their green flight suits a sharp contrast to the yellow dunes. They didn't waste time with words. They ushered the Poseidon's crew into the cabins, the heavy beat of the rotors vibrating through everyone's chests. As the helicopters lifted off, Sullivan looked out the window. He saw the P-8 one last time. It sat alone, on the island, a monument to a mission that had gone horribly wrong. The Iranian coast was a hazy line on the northern horizon, silent and indifferent. Somewhere beneath those waters lay the remains of the Phantom and the pilot who had tried to kill them. There would be investigations, diplomatic cables, and high-level meetings in Washington and Tehran. But for the crew, the war had lasted exactly 11 minutes. The helicopters turned south, heading back toward the USS Abraham Lincoln. The 2 Super Hornets moved into a close escort position, their wings glinting in the late afternoon sun. The sky was beginning to turn a soft shade of orange and pink the violence of the afternoon fading into the quiet beauty of a Gulf sunset. The P-8 was gone, and the Iranian jet was gone. But the line in the sand remained. The silent war in the shadows would continue, fought by men and women in pressurized cabins and humming computer rooms, all of them knowing how quickly a routine patrol could turn into a fight for survival. The helicopters crossed the threshold of the carrier's deck 10 minutes later. As the 10 wheels touched the steel, the engines began their slow wind down. The crew stepped out into the humid air of the North Arabian Sea, greeted by the familiar smells of jet fuel and sea salt. They were home.